After learning about the lake house, I began looking at everything differently. The world around me hadn't changed. My home was the same. The neighborhood was the same. Even the people I loved were the same. The only thing that had changed was the way I listened. Once you discover that someone has hidden one important truth from you, ordinary conversations stop feeling ordinary. Every sentence carries a little more weight. Every pause feels intentional. Every explanation invites another question. For years, I had accepted things at face value. If Daniel canceled dinner because work was busy, I believed him. If Vanessa explained why they couldn't visit for the holidays, I smiled and told them I understood. If relatives slowly stopped calling as often, I assumed everyone was simply growing older and busier. It never occurred to me that there might be another reason. Now, I wasn't so sure. I wasn't looking for lies. But I had stopped assuming I was hearing the whole truth. The binder on my dining room table had become part of my daily routine. Each morning, I added another note. Another memory. Another question. Not because I enjoyed living in the past. Because I had finally realized the past was still shaping my present. 3 days passed without hearing from Daniel. That wasn't unusual anymore. Years ago, silence between us would have worried him. Now it had become almost normal. I wondered if he was thinking about our phone call. I wondered if Vanessa knew he had spoken with me. Mostly, I wondered whether either of them realized I had started asking questions. Late Thursday afternoon, just as I was watering the flowers on my front porch, my phone rang. The screen displayed a familiar name. Evelyn Carter. Thomas's older sister. I smiled before answering. Evelyn and I had known each other for more than 40 years. She had welcomed me into the family long before Thomas and I were married. Even after his death, she still called every few weeks just to check on me. "Hello, Evelyn." "Margaret, sweetheart." Her warm voice immediately made me smile. "How are you?" "Oh, you know me," I replied with a quiet laugh. "Still trying to keep my roses alive." She chuckled. "Thomas always said you talked to those flowers more than you talked to people." He wasn't entirely wrong. For a few minutes, we chatted about ordinary things. The weather. Her arthritis. A neighbor who had finally sold his house after months on the market. It was comfortable. Familiar. Exactly the kind of conversation two women our age have after decades of knowing each other. Then her voice became noticeably gentler. "Margaret." "Yes?" "There was something I've been meaning to ask you." "Of course." She hesitated. Not because she was unsure. Because she was trying to be kind. "I just wanted to make sure you're doing all right." "I am. And..." Another pause. "I hope you're settling in." I frowned. "Settling in?" "Yes." I waited. She continued carefully. "At the retirement community." For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard her correctly. "I'm sorry. What retirement community?" There was silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that arrives when two people suddenly realize they are talking about completely different realities. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "Daniel told us you decided it was time." "Time for what?" "To move into assisted living." I gripped the porch railing. "I've never moved into assisted living." "You haven't?" "No. I'm standing on my own front porch." The silence that followed felt endless. Then Evelyn spoke in a voice I had never heard from her before. Confused. Almost frightened. "But Daniel said it was your decision. He told the family you wanted to downsize. He said you didn't want the responsibility of maintaining the house anymore. He said you'd found a lovely place where people could help with meals and housekeeping." I couldn't find my voice. Every word felt unreal. Not because it was impossible. Because someone had taken my life. And rewritten it. Finally, I managed to whisper. "Evelyn. I never said any of that." The line went completely silent. I stood frozen on my porch, the watering can still hanging from one hand. Cars passed in front of my house. Children laughed somewhere down the street. The world carried on as if nothing had happened. But in that moment, I realized something that sent a chill through me. The story Daniel had told me about the lake house wasn't the only story that didn't match the truth. Somehow, my own son had been telling our family a completely different version of my life. And I had only just begun to hear it. After I hung up with Evelyn, I remained on my front porch for a long time. The watering can was still in my hand, but the flowers at my feet had long since stopped needing water. My thoughts were somewhere else. I kept replaying her words. Daniel said it was your decision. He said you wanted to move into assisted living. He said he was respecting your wishes. I looked around at the little house Thomas and I had shared for more than 40 years. The porch swing he built with his own hands still hung from its chains. The flower beds I had planted every spring were blooming beautifully. The kitchen window was open just enough to let in the afternoon breeze. Nothing about my life resembled the picture Evelyn had described. Yet somehow, that was the story everyone else believed. I wanted to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. Perhaps Daniel had spoken carelessly. Perhaps someone had misunderstood his words and passed them along. Families have a way of turning simple conversations into complicated rumors. At least, that's what I told myself. For less than an hour. The next phone call came just before dinner. It was my cousin Linda. We hadn't spoken in several months, but she greeted me with the same warmth she always had. Margaret, I just wanted to see how you're settling in. I closed my eyes. Settling into what? The retirement place. Again. The exact same story? I don't live in a retirement community, Linda. There was an awkward silence. Oh. I thought. She hesitated. Daniel told everyone you were happy there. I've never even toured one. She sounded embarrassed. I'm so sorry. Don't be. And I meant it. Linda hadn't lied to me. She had simply believed what she had been told. By the time we finished talking, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a story. A story that had traveled farther than I ever imagined. The following morning, another call came. Then another. By the end of the weekend, I had spoken with Thomas's nephew, one of our old neighbors, and 2 friends from church. Every conversation followed almost the same pattern. They would ask how I was adjusting. I would ask what they meant. Then they would gently explain what Daniel had told them. Some versions were slightly different. Some were almost identical. But they all shared the same ending. Daniel had done the right thing. He's such a thoughtful son. I'm glad he respected your wishes. It couldn't have been easy for him. You raised a wonderful young man. Each compliment landed like a small stone. Not because I wanted people to think poorly of Daniel. I never did. But because every kind word rested on something that wasn't true. One conversation stayed with me more than the others. It was with my longtime friend Carol. We had met nearly 30 years earlier through a volunteer reading program at the local library. Carol had always spoken honestly, even when honesty was uncomfortable. I have to admit, she said, I admired Daniel. For what? For not making you feel guilty. I frowned. What do you mean? My own children fought me every time I mentioned downsizing. She laughed softly. But Daniel told everyone he wanted to honor your independence. I didn't answer. Carol continued. He said moving into assisted living was your idea. He said he promised not to stand in your way. Her voice carried genuine admiration. I thought that was incredibly loving. I looked across my living room. My husband's photograph rested on the mantel. His reading glasses still sat beside his favorite chair. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor exactly as it had for years. This wasn't the home of someone who had willingly packed up her life and moved away. It was the home of someone who had never left. I never asked to move anywhere, I said quietly. Carol became very still. Oh. Then. I don't know why he told everyone that. Neither did I. Not yet. After we ended the call, I made another section in my binder. I labeled it, Retirement Home Story. Beneath the heading, I wrote every name. Every conversation. Every version of the same claim. The more I wrote, the more one detail stood out. None of these people had spoken to me before believing the story. Why would they? Daniel was my son. If he said his mother had decided to move into assisted living, why would anyone question him? They trusted him. Just as I always had. I wasn't angry with any of them. How could I be? People can only believe the information they're given. If someone tells a convincing story often enough, it slowly becomes everyone else's memory too. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers misunderstood my life. Because the people who loved me had accepted someone else's version of it without ever hearing mine. For 70 years, I had believed every person has one story. Their own. The story they live. The story they remember. The story they tell. Now I understood something far more unsettling. Sometimes another person begins telling your story for you. Quietly. Confidently. One conversation at a time. Until eventually, their version becomes the only one anyone has ever heard. I walked into the hallway and stopped in front of the family photographs lining the wall. There was one of Thomas holding Daniel as a baby. Another from Daniel's high school graduation. One from his wedding day, with Vanessa smiling beautifully between us. Every picture represented a moment I had actually lived. No one could take those memories away. But memories are private. Stories are public. And somewhere between those two things, I realized I had begun disappearing. Not from my home. Not from my family. From my own life. The most painful part wasn't that I had been left out of family decisions. It wasn't even that someone had lied about me. It was something much deeper. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I no longer owned the story of who I was. Someone else had been telling it for me. And everyone I loved believed them instead. After hearing the same story from so many different people, I found myself asking a question I had been avoiding. How had the truth become so completely unrecognizable? Everyone believed I had chosen to leave my home. No one knew how. Slowly that decision had been built around me. People often imagine life-changing moments as dramatic events. A single argument. A slammed door. A cruel sentence that can never be taken back. That wasn't what happened to me. My story was quieter than that. Much quieter. It began almost a year before Thomas's sister called. At first, Vanessa only made small observations. Always with a smile. Always sounding concerned. "You know, Margaret," she said one Sunday afternoon as we washed dishes together, "this house is awfully big for one person." I smiled. "It feels smaller than it used to." She laughed politely. "I suppose it would." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Still, I'd worry about you here by yourself." I thanked her for caring. At the time, I thought she was simply being thoughtful. A few weeks later, she brought it up again. This time while we were drinking coffee after church. "I read an article about seniors living alone." She looked genuinely concerned. "It said falls are one of the biggest risks." Daniel nodded. "I've heard that too." I smiled. "I'm still pretty steady on my feet." "You are," Vanessa agreed quickly. "But accidents happen." There was nothing unreasonable about that conversation. Nothing anyone could point to as manipulation. It sounded like concern. Because concern and persuasion often wear the same face. Over the next several months, the subject returned again and again. Never as an argument. Never as pressure. Just gentle reminders. What if you slipped in the shower? What if your power went out during a storm? What if you got sick in the middle of the night? Each question sounded perfectly sensible. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they slowly changed the atmosphere around me. Then came the brochures. Vanessa left one on my kitchen counter after Sunday dinner. "I thought you might find this interesting." It showed smiling retirees walking through beautiful gardens. Comfortable apartments. Exercise classes. Community dinners. "It doesn't mean you have to move," she said. "I just thought you'd like to see what places are like these days." I thanked her and placed the brochure in a drawer. A month later, another brochure appeared. Then another. Soon the idea wasn't new anymore. It had become familiar. Daniel rarely introduced the subject himself. That was something I only realized much later. Instead, Vanessa would begin the conversation. Daniel would listen quietly. Then, before we left the table, he would say something like, "You know, Vanessa does have a point." Or, "It might be safer." Or, "We're just thinking about the future." The words changed. The message stayed the same. I noticed something else as well. Daniel no longer sounded like he was sharing his own opinion. He sounded like someone reaching the same conclusion after hearing it often enough. At first, he still defended me. One evening I remember him saying, "Mom's doing fine. I don't think we need to rush anything." I felt grateful. Vanessa simply smiled. "Of course. I just don't want us waiting until something terrible happens." There was no argument. No disagreement. She never insisted. She simply planted another seed. Weeks later, Daniel repeated the very same sentence. "What if we wait until something terrible happens?" I remember looking at him. The words sounded familiar. Not because he had said them before. Because someone else had. Gradually, our family dinners became less frequent. At first, work was the excuse. Construction deadlines. Business trips. Late meetings. Then birthdays became shorter. Holiday meals ended earlier. Sunday afternoons quietly disappeared altogether. The house that had once echoed with laughter grew quieter each month. Sometimes an entire week passed without hearing Daniel's voice. When they did visit, something had changed. I couldn't quite explain it. The conversations stayed polite. But they no longer felt easy. There were longer silences. More glances exchanged between Daniel and Vanessa. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Whenever I asked simple questions, Vanessa often answered before Daniel had the chance. "What time are you coming next weekend?" "We're not sure yet." I was asking Daniel. I know. He was just about to say the same thing. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he would have. But after a while, I noticed he rarely corrected her. He simply nodded. As though her answers had become his own. The loneliness surprised me more than anything else. Not because I lived alone. I had already grown accustomed to that after Thomas died. It was a different kind of loneliness. The feeling that I was slowly becoming unnecessary. The house remained mine. The photographs on the walls were mine. The memories in every room were mine. Yet somehow, I began feeling like a guest inside my own life. One afternoon, Daniel walked through the living room, looked around, and quietly said, "This place is just too much for one person." I looked at him. Those weren't words my son would have chosen years earlier. He used to call it home. Now he called it this place. The difference broke something inside me. I never argued. I never accused either of them of trying to push me out. Instead, I found myself apologizing more often. "I'm sorry the yard needs work. I'm sorry the stairs worry you. I'm sorry the house is such a burden." Looking back now, I wonder why I apologized at all. Perhaps because when people hear the same message often enough, they begin believing they are the problem. Eventually, the conversations stopped being about possibilities. They became about plans. Vanessa started mentioning waiting lists. Availability. Floor plans. Activities. Daniel asked whether I had thought about downsizing. Not because he wanted to hurt me. Because by then, I truly believe he thought he was helping. That's what made it so painful. He didn't see the pressure anymore. He only saw the solution. The day I packed my first box, no one forced me to leave. No one threatened me. No one raised their voice. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, I left because something much quieter had happened. Home is more than walls. More than furniture. More than an address printed on an envelope. Home is the place where you feel wanted. And little by little, conversation by conversation, visit after visit, that feeling disappeared. By the time I finally walked out the front door carrying the first box of my belongings, I wasn't following my own dream. I was surrendering to one that had been repeated so many times that everyone else believed it belonged to me. The cruelest part wasn't leaving the house. It was hearing my own son tell the world that it had been my choice. Because deep in my heart, I knew the truth. I hadn't left because I wanted a different life. I left because I no longer felt welcome in the one I already had. Daniel came to visit me 4 days after I moved into the retirement home. I still remember the sound of his knock. 3 gentle taps on the door. Careful. Polite. Almost nervous. I was sitting beside the small window in my new room, looking down at the courtyard below. 2 women were walking slowly along the garden path, one holding the other's elbow. Somewhere down the hallway, a television played too loudly, followed by a burst of laughter from a group activity room. It was not an unpleasant place. That was the hardest part to explain. The staff was kind. The meals were warm. The hallways were clean. There were flowers in the lobby and framed watercolor paintings on the walls. Nothing about the place was cruel. But kindness does not turn a place into home. Come in, I called. Daniel opened the door with a small bouquet of daisies in one hand. Hey, Mom. I smiled because he looked so much like the boy he used to be. Tall now. Broad-shouldered. A successful man with tired eyes. But for 1 second, standing in that doorway, he was still my son. Hello, sweetheart. He stepped inside and looked around the room. You've made it nice. I glanced at the few framed photographs on the dresser, the folded quilt at the foot of the bed, and the small lamp I had brought from my old living room. I've done what I can. He placed the flowers in a glass of water and set them on the windowsill. Vanessa said daisies would brighten the room. Of course she did. I kept my smile gentle. They're lovely. Daniel sat in the chair across from me. For a moment neither of us spoke. He looked uncomfortable, but not guilty. There is a difference. Guilt looks backward. Discomfort only wants the present moment to end. Finally, he leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. I know this has been a big change. I nodded. It has. But I really think it's better this way. I looked at him carefully. He wasn't speaking harshly. He wasn't dismissing me. He sounded sincere. That almost made it worse. Better for whom? I asked softly. His brow tightened. For you, Mom. He said it as if the answer should have been obvious. There are people here who can look after you. I was looking after myself. I know, but this is different. He gestured toward the hallway. If something happens, someone is right there. I folded my hands in my lap. Something has not happened yet. But it could. His voice carried a trace of anxiety now. You're alone most of the time. I have lived alone since your father died. Exactly. That word stayed in the room between us. Exactly. As though my grief had become evidence against me. Daniel rubbed his hands together, searching for the right words. I just want you to be safe. I believed him. That was the painful truth. My son was not sitting across from me because he wanted to punish me. He was not smiling cruelly. He was not enjoying my loneliness. He believed he had protected me. And because he believed it, he could not see what it had cost. Vanessa also thinks this is the best decision. He added. There it was. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just one small sentence that explained far more than he realized. I looked at him. Does she? Yes. He nodded quickly. She did a lot of research. I'm sure she did. She found this place. I know. She talked to the director. I know that too. And honestly, Mom, I think she was right. He looked relieved after saying it, as though borrowing Vanessa's certainty gave him a place to stand. I watched him with a sadness I could not put into words. Daniel had always wanted peace. Even as a child, he hated conflict. If 2 classmates argued, he tried to make them laugh. If Thomas and I disagreed about money or schedules, Daniel grew quiet at the dinner table until one of us changed the subject. He had a good heart. But a good heart can still become weak when it is too afraid to question the person it loves. Are you happy here? I asked. He looked startled. What? Are you happy that I'm here? I mean. He hesitated. I feel better knowing. You're safe. That isn't what I asked. He looked down at his hands. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. I don't know how to answer that. I did not press him. The truth had already shown itself. Daniel knew how to talk about safety. He knew how to talk about responsibility. He knew how to repeat every reason Vanessa had given him. But he had not asked the simplest question. Was I happy? Had I wanted this? Did I still wake up each morning reaching for a life that had been packed into boxes and carried away? He looked around the room again. It's not so bad, is it? I followed his gaze. The single bed. The narrow closet. The small table where my medication sat beside a stack of books. The window that looked out onto a courtyard I had never planted. No, I said quietly. It's not so bad. He seemed comforted by that. I hated that my answer comforted him. Because not so bad was not the same as home. But Daniel heard what he needed to hear. He stood after half an hour. Work was busy. Vanessa was waiting. There were calls he needed to return. Before leaving, he hugged me tightly. I love you, Mom. I love you too. And I did. Even then. Especially then. After he left, I stood by the window and watched him cross the parking lot. He walked quickly, phone already in his hand, shoulders tense beneath his suit jacket. He was not a villain. That was what broke my heart. A villain would have been easier to hate. Daniel was something much more complicated. A son who thought he was doing the right thing. A man who trusted his wife more than his own questions. A child of mine who had become so focused on keeping me safe that he had stopped asking whether I still felt alive. That day, I did not cry because Daniel was angry with me. He wasn't. I cried because he truly believed every word he said. And somewhere along the way, my son had stopped wondering whether his mother was happy at all. The morning after Daniel's visit, I woke before sunrise. Sleep had become unreliable since leaving my home. Some nights I barely closed my eyes. Other nights I dreamed I was walking through my old kitchen, only to wake and find unfamiliar walls waiting for me instead. I made myself a cup of tea in the small kitchenette attached to my room and sat by the window. The binder I had started after discovering the truth about the lake house rested on the table. For several minutes, I simply looked at it. Then my eyes drifted toward the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Inside was my old cell phone. I hadn't used it in months. Daniel had surprised me with a newer smartphone a year earlier. It's easier to use, he had said. This one has a bigger screen. He had transferred my contacts and photos for me. The old phone had been placed in a drawer and quietly forgotten. Until now. I took it out and brushed away a thin layer of dust. The battery was dead, but I still had the charger tucked into a small zippered pouch. Some habits never leave you. Thomas always kept every cord that came with every piece of electronics we ever owned. I used to tease him for it. That morning, I silently thanked him. After nearly 20 minutes, the screen flickered to life. The wallpaper appeared. A photograph of Thomas standing beside our maple tree, smiling as though he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. I smiled back. Then I opened the Messages app. At first, there was nothing surprising. Birthday wishes. Church announcements. Reminders from the pharmacy. Pictures of my neighbor's new puppy. Ordinary pieces of an ordinary life. Then I reached the conversations with Vanessa. I wasn't looking for proof. Not exactly. I was trying to remember. Memory can be gentle with painful experiences. Sometimes too gentle. It softens sharp edges until we begin wondering whether we imagined them. Messages don't do that. They wait exactly as they were written. I scrolled backward month by month. There it was. A text from almost 11 months earlier. Vanessa. Margaret, if everything goes according to plan, it would really help if you could be moved out by the end of September. I frowned. Moved out. Not. If you decide to move? Not. If you're ready? Simply. Moved out. I continued reading. Me. I haven't decided to leave the house. Her reply came only minutes later. I know, but we really need to stay on schedule. Stay on schedule. I read those words 3 times. Schedule for what? At the time, I had assumed she meant planning ahead. Now they sounded very different. I reached for my notebook and copied the exchange word for word. No assumptions. No conclusions. Just the facts. Further down the conversation, another message caught my attention. The contractor wants to know when the house will be empty. I stared at the screen. The contractor? I searched my memory. I had never hired a contractor. I replied to her message months ago with a simple question. Why would a contractor need to know? Vanessa answered almost immediately. Just exploring options. At the time, I accepted that explanation. Now I wasn't so sure. I continued scrolling. Another message. Another date. Another conversation I had nearly forgotten. The realtor suggested early fall would be the best time. The realtor. Not a realtor. The realtor. As though someone had already been chosen. My heartbeat quickened. I searched through my email archive next. Thankfully, my old phone still contained copies that hadn't been deleted. Most were ordinary. Receipts. Church newsletters. Medical appointment reminders. Then I found a chain of emails with Vanessa copied on every reply. The subject line read, Property Consultation. I opened the first message. A local real estate office thanked Vanessa for meeting with them to discuss future plans for the property. Future plans. The second email referenced possible renovations that would increase market value before listing. Before listing. I checked the date. It had been sent nearly 6 weeks before I ever agreed to leave my house. I read it again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. No. The dates were unmistakable. Someone had already been discussing selling my home while I was still living in it. I had not signed anything. I had not agreed to move. Yet plans were already moving forward. My hands trembled slightly as I continued searching. Then I found something that made me stop breathing for a moment. A confirmation email. Tour appointment confirmed. The message thanked Vanessa for scheduling a visit to the retirement community. Date. Time. Guest names. Daniel Anderson. Vanessa Anderson. Margaret Anderson. I stared at the screen. I remembered that visit. Or rather, I remembered what I had believed it was. Vanessa had told me we were just looking. No pressure, she had said with a reassuring smile. It never hurts to gather information. I had believed her. The email told a different story. The subject line included another phrase. Move-in consultation, not a tour. Not an informational visit. A move-in consultation. And the appointment had been scheduled almost 3 weeks before anyone asked whether I wanted to leave my home. I leaned back slowly. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside my window, a groundskeeper pushed a lawn mower across the courtyard. Residents chatted on nearby benches. Life continued exactly as it always had. Inside my room, everything had changed. I wasn't discovering opinions anymore. I was discovering timelines. Dates. Appointments. Written conversations. Unlike memories, they couldn't be reshaped by emotion. Unlike conversations, they couldn't be denied. Every document told the same story. The decision had not unfolded naturally. It had been organized. Step by step. Conversation by conversation. Appointment by appointment. Long before anyone asked what I wanted. I carefully printed each email and slipped it into a plastic sleeve inside my binder. Next came the text messages. Then the appointment confirmation. Each document found its own place. Not because I enjoyed collecting evidence against my own family. Because every page answered a question my heart had been asking. Was I imagining this? The answer was no. I closed the binder gently and rested my hand on its cover. Thomas used to tell Daniel that paper has a remarkable memory. It never forgets the date. He was right. People forget. People misunderstand. People convince themselves that yesterday happened differently than it did. But messages don't lie. Emails don't invent timelines. Appointments don't schedule themselves. For months, I had wondered whether I was being unfair. Whether grief had made me suspicious. Whether loneliness had clouded my judgment. Now, for the first time, I no longer questioned myself. The evidence said what I had been unable to say aloud. My move to the retirement home had not been the result of my own decision. It had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Long before anyone ever asked me what I wanted. A week after I found the messages on my old phone, Daniel came to visit again. This time, Vanessa came with him. She arrived carrying a paper bag from my favorite bakery. I remembered you like blueberry scones, she said with her usual gracious smile. That was thoughtful, I replied. And it was. One thing I had learned about Vanessa over the years was that kindness and calculation could exist in the same gesture. The three of us sat together in the small sitting area outside my room. Other families were visiting nearby. A little girl colored quietly at a corner table, while her grandfather watched with sleepy eyes. A volunteer played old jazz standards on the piano near the lobby. Everything about the afternoon appeared peaceful. Ordinary. If someone had walked past us, they would have seen a devoted son visiting his mother, and a considerate daughter-in-law making sure she felt included. Appearances have always been easy to believe. Reality usually requires more patience. Daniel talked about work. A new commercial building. Permit delays. Rising material costs. I listened, asking questions the way mothers always do, even when their children are nearly 40. Vanessa filled the quiet moments with pleasant conversation. She complimented the flowers outside. She mentioned a new cafe that had opened downtown. She laughed at one of Daniel's stories before he reached the punchline. Anyone watching us would have thought we were an ordinary family enjoying an ordinary afternoon. Then Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and sighed. I'm sorry. It's the office. I need to take this. Go ahead, I said. He stepped into a hallway, still apologizing as he answered the call. Within seconds, his voice faded into the distance. For the first time that afternoon, Vanessa and I were alone. Neither of us spoke immediately. She stirred her coffee slowly. The spoon made soft circles against the porcelain cup. Finally, she looked up and smiled. You've settled in nicely. I've adjusted. There's a difference, she said with a knowing expression. I suppose there is. She nodded toward the courtyard. People seem to like you here. They've been kind. They usually are. Her tone remained warm. Almost comforting. Then she said something that made me look at her more carefully. People get used to change faster than we expect. I wasn't sure what she meant. They do? They have to. She took another sip of coffee before continuing. At first, everyone talks. They ask questions. They wonder if the decision was the right one. I listened without interrupting. But after a while, she shrugged lightly. Life moves on. I felt a strange uneasiness settle inside me. I'm not sure I understand. I'm just saying that memories are funny. She smiled again. They're much easier to shape than people realize. The sentence sounded harmless. Almost philosophical. Yet something about it made me sit a little straighter. She leaned back in her chair and lowered her voice just enough that only I could hear. Eventually, everyone gets used to it. I waited. She glanced toward the hallway to make sure Daniel was still occupied with his phone call. Then she looked back at me. After enough time passes, no one remembers how these things really began. She said it gently, almost kindly. Not as a threat. Not as a warning. as though she were sharing a simple fact about human nature. The words hung between us. I studied her face. She wasn't smiling broadly. She wasn't gloating. If anything, she looked perfectly calm. Perfectly confident. As though she had already watched this happen before. I chose my next words carefully. Do you think that's a good thing? She tilted her head. I think it's inevitable. I said nothing. She continued in the same soft voice. Families don't hold on to details forever. They remember whatever helps them move forward. There was no anger in her tone. No bitterness. Only certainty. For a brief moment, I felt as though I wasn't speaking to my daughter-in-law at all. I was speaking to someone who understood exactly how stories become accepted as truth. Daniel returned a few moments later. I'm sorry about that. He looked from Vanessa to me. What did I miss? Vanessa smiled at him. Oh, nothing important. We were just talking. Daniel accepted the answer without another question. He sat down and immediately began telling us about the phone call from work. I watched him as he spoke. He had no idea what had just been said. No idea that the conversation had shifted the ground beneath my feet. No idea that I had just heard the clearest explanation yet of everything that had happened over the past year. Until that afternoon, I believed Vanessa wanted practical things. The house. The property. The convenience of having me somewhere else. Those were certainly part of it. But sitting across from her, listening to the quiet confidence in her voice, I realized I had been looking at only half the picture. The house had never been the final prize. Houses can be bought, sold, renovated, replaced. Stories are far more valuable. If you control the story, you control how people remember the past. You control who appears reasonable, who appears difficult, who appears generous, who appears selfish. And eventually, people stop asking whether the story is true. They simply repeat it. I thought about Evelyn. About Carol. About every relative who sincerely believed I had chosen to leave my home. None of them had wanted to hurt me. They had simply accepted the version they were given. Not because they were careless. Because someone had presented that version with complete confidence. As Daniel helped me clear the coffee cups from the table, I looked once more at Vanessa. She smiled exactly as she always did. Warm. Polite. Effortlessly gracious. Anyone watching us would have seen a loving daughter-in-law caring for her husband's elderly mother. Only I knew what I had heard. And for the first time, I understood something that frightened me far more than the loss of my home. Vanessa wasn't trying to take my house. She was trying to take ownership of my story. Because once people stop believing your version of your own life, they stop asking you for it altogether. After Daniel and Vanessa left that afternoon, I closed the door to my room and stood quietly. For several minutes. The hallway outside slowly returned to its usual rhythm. A nurse pushed a medication cart past my door. Someone down the hall laughed at a television game show. Dinner trays rattled as they were stacked onto a cart. Life continued exactly as it always did. Inside my room, however, something had changed. For the first time since Thomas died, I stopped waiting for someone else to uncover the truth. I understood that if the truth was ever going to matter, I would have to protect it myself. I sat down at the small desk beneath the window and looked at the binder. It had started as nothing more than a place to keep my husband's letter. Now it had become something else entirely. It was becoming the history of everything no one else seemed willing to remember. I reached for my phone. Daniel's name appeared near the top of my recent calls. For a brief moment, I considered pressing it. I imagined asking him one simple question. Did you really tell everyone I wanted to move here? Then I imagined what would happen next. He would hesitate. He would try to explain. Perhaps he would tell me I had misunderstood. Perhaps he would say he only wanted to make things easier for the family. Or perhaps he would repeat exactly what Vanessa had already taught him to believe. No. That conversation could wait. Arguments have a strange way of making people defend the very thing they should be questioning. If I confronted Daniel too soon, he would feel forced to choose between believing his wife and believing his mother. I already knew which choice he would make. Not because he loved me less. Because certainty is easier to defend than doubt. Instead of calling him, I opened my laptop. One by one, I began organizing everything I had collected. First came the text messages. I carefully exported every conversation with Vanessa that mentioned my moving, the house, contractors, schedules, or future plans. Then I printed each page. I didn't highlight anything. I didn't write angry notes in the margins. I simply placed every message into a clear plastic sleeve. Dates first. Words second. Facts only. Next came the emails. The appointment confirmations. The real estate correspondence. The property consultation. The retirement community visit that had been arranged weeks before anyone had asked what I wanted. Every document received its own section. Every page found its proper place. As the stack grew larger, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't collecting evidence against my family. I was preserving the truth before it disappeared. There is an important difference. The afternoon sunlight slowly crossed the floor as I worked. By evening, another idea came to me. I opened a fresh notebook. Across the first page, I wrote 3 words. Timeline of events. Then I began. Thomas dies. Vanessa first mentions the house being too large. The first brochure arrives. The conversations about safety begin. Family dinners become less frequent. The retirement home tour is scheduled. Emails about the property. Messages requesting I move out by a certain date. The move itself. Phone calls from relatives who believed it had all been my decision. One event after another. Each connected to the next. When viewed separately, none of them seemed especially remarkable. Together, they told a story no one had intended for me to see. Patterns often hide inside ordinary moments. You only notice them when you step back far enough. As I finished writing, I remembered something Thomas used to say whenever Daniel struggled with a difficult math problem. Don't stare at one number. Look for the pattern. I smiled sadly. He had been teaching our son about mathematics. Without realizing it, he had also been teaching me about people. Late that evening, I made a second copy of every important document. One set remained inside the binder. The other went into a sealed envelope that I tucked into the back of my closet. Perhaps I was being overly cautious. Or perhaps I had finally learned that memories can fade, but paper has remarkable endurance. I wasn't preparing for a courtroom. I wasn't planning some dramatic confrontation. I simply refused to let my own life be rewritten without leaving behind the original version. Before going to bed, I opened the binder one last time. Thomas's letter rested in the first section. The photographs of the lake house followed. Property tax receipts. Frank's recollections. The text messages. The emails. Appointment confirmations. Phone conversations. The timeline. Every page represented a small piece of a much larger picture. Individually, they could be dismissed. Together, they spoke with quiet certainty. I closed the binder and rested both hands on its cover. For so long, I had believed that staying silent was the same thing as keeping the peace. I understand now that they are not the same. Silence often protects the person telling the lie. Truth protects the person who has lived it. I still had no intention of arguing with Vanessa. I still wasn't ready to confront Daniel. Neither of them needed to know what I was doing. Not yet. There would come a day when my son would begin asking questions of his own. I didn't know when. I didn't know what would finally open his eyes. Perhaps it would be something small. Perhaps it would be something devastating. But I believed that day would come. And when it did, I wanted to be ready. I wanted him to see something stronger than my grief. Something more reliable than my memory. I looked once more at the binder before turning out the light. Then I whispered a promise to myself. If one day Daniel wants to know the truth, I won't have only my memories. I'll have the evidence. A week passed quietly. Or at least, it appeared to. I spent my mornings reading by the window, my afternoons organizing the growing stack of documents in my binder, and my evenings wondering how many more pieces of the story were still hidden from me. The retirement community had settled into its familiar routine. Breakfast at 8. Exercise classes at 10. Lunch at noon. Everything happened on schedule. Predictable. Orderly. Safe. I had begun recognizing the nurses by name. They greeted me with warm smiles and asked about the books I was reading. Most days, I almost convinced myself that life here could become ordinary. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed again. I had just finished returning a library book to the small reading room when I stopped outside the administrative office. The door wasn't completely closed. Inside, 2 staff members were organizing paperwork. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I intended to keep walking. Then I heard my own name. Mrs. Anderson's file. I paused without thinking. One of the women laughed softly. Her son was just here this morning. The paperwork's finally complete. Another voice replied. That's good. It makes everything much simpler. What paperwork? The first woman asked. The management forms. He signed the remaining documents before he left. I felt my grip tighten around the library book. Management forms? The first employee shuffled a stack of folders. I always feel bad for families having to deal with all this. At least her son seems very involved. Oh, definitely. He's been handling almost everything. Almost everything. The words echoed in my mind. I took one slow step toward the doorway. Before either of them noticed me, one of the folders shifted as it was placed on the counter. For just a brief second, I caught sight of the label. Margaret Anderson, my name. On a file I had never seen. A nurse looked up and smiled. Oh, Mrs. Anderson. I didn't realize you were there. I forced a smile of my own. I was just returning a book. She nodded pleasantly. Your son stopped by earlier. He's taking wonderful care of everything. I swallowed carefully. What exactly is he taking care of? She glanced toward the folder before looking back at me. Oh. I'm sure he'll explain it to you. The answer was polite. Professional. Perfectly reasonable. It also told me nothing. I didn't ask another question. Instead, I wished them both a pleasant afternoon and walked slowly back toward my room. Each step felt heavier than the last. Inside, I closed the door and sat quietly beside the window. The binder rested exactly where I had left it. Until that moment, I believed I understood the situation. I believed the lies were about the house. About the retirement community. About the story my family had been told. Now I wasn't so sure. If Daniel had signed documents concerning my affairs, without ever discussing them with me, what else had already happened? How many decisions had been made in my name? How many signatures had appeared on papers I had never read? How many conversations had taken place without me? I opened the binder but didn't add a single page. Instead, I stared at the growing collection of evidence. For the first time, it no longer felt like I was investigating one lie. It felt as though I had uncovered the edge of something much larger. Something I still couldn't see clearly. Outside my window, the evening sun slipped lower behind the trees. The courtyard grew quieter as residents returned to their rooms. I rested one hand on the binder and whispered the question that frightened me more than any other. If Daniel could truly believe that I chose to come here, what else has my son accepted as the truth simply because someone else told him it was? The thought settled deep inside me. Not as anger. Not even as fear. As grief. Because I had the terrible feeling that whatever answer waited ahead, it would shatter far more than a mother's heart.